Moonlighter is a game produced and kickstarted by Digital Sun and released on May 29, 2018. It completely flew under my radar, and I was only made aware of it when I heard it got released recently on the Nintendo Switch. It had a pretty emotional trailer that really sold me on the premise of a merchant who wanted to pursue his dream of becoming an adventurer. I won't be showing the final boss or anything, but as usual, if you want to experience the game without being spoiled in any capacity, just go buy it. Moonlighter is, as you probably pieced together from the visuals thus far, an absolutely breathtaking 2D game with a lot of attention and care put into the aesthetic. The premise and story are quite simple. You play as Will, the son of a merchant family running a store known as the Moonlighter, and your parents left the store in your capable hands when they passed away. During the day, you sell goods and turn a profit, but after closing the store at night, you pick up your satchel and weapon and take to the dungeons to pursue unforeseen riches and fulfill your dreams of being an adventurer. Will may be nothing special as a character, but my upbringing leaves me biased to liking characters with white hair. Sue me. Comparisons have been made between Reciteer, an obvious choice since it has an identical premise. But as someone who is gradually starting to grow out of loving ugu chou kawaii ne anime titles, I welcome a variety of games to try the roguelite, merchant simulator type of gameplay Moonlighter accomplishes so adeptly. I don't think it necessarily stole the idea, but I do think it executed the concept better. It started as a Kickstarter that looked promising and raised over $134,000, and I'm glad to see backers weren't let down, as Moonlighter strikes a perfect balance between difficulty and enjoyability, while offering a lot in terms of the grandiose, majestic soundtrack, which I'll address in depth momentarily. I played on hard mode per the game's recommendation, and while I got destroyed plenty of times, it never left me feeling like the failure was undeserved. It was usually my fault for not dodging properly or learning the enemy's AI, and I found myself rushing back into the dungeon to get revenge and reclaim the treasure which was so bitterly repossessed. The daytime sales mechanics are simple enough, consisting of guessing the right prices and making adjustments in response to the customer's reactions. A greedy coin expression means you sold something for too cheap, a happy face means you got it just right, an annoyed face means it's a little unreasonable, and an angry face means it's exorbitantly overpriced. Sometimes thieves will come in and try to steal from you, and you have to catch and pummel them before they make off with your goods. You can expand your store from having a small 4-item showcase to having a ton of floor space, as well as a personal assistant to help you around the store or sell your stock for you while you run off to the dungeons. The dungeon crawling is great fun, if not a bit formulaic, despite being procedurally generated. You have the option of using a sword and shield, greatsword, fists, spear, bow and arrow, or the broom if you want to be hardcore, with an achievement being available should you undertake the challenge. There are even achievements for beating the bosses without taking damage, but I'm a little sissy boy, so I just focused on completing the game as best I could. My weapons of choice were the spear and bow, since a lot of the enemy's AI is activated by being in close proximity, and preserving your health and armor is vital for getting to the final floor. I won't go into too much detail about the monster and dungeon mechanics in case anyone wants to experience the whole thing blind, since the meatiest part of the game is undoubtedly the forgivable yet challenging exploration-rich gameplay, but I really enjoyed the enemy variety combined with the experimental designs and masterfully scored soundtrack. It's safe to say that the game was entirely elevated to a legendary status in my mind thanks to the beautiful pieces written by Fenn, who had also previously composed for Titan Souls, a minimalistic tough-as-nails adventure combat game that I'm really fucking bad at. As is typical in my reviews of games with brilliantly scored music, I'll be attempting to articulate the soundtrack, but I'd like to preface my notes by clarifying, per usual, that I'm not a musical academic by any stretch of the imagination. So if I get some of these wrong, then I apologize to Mr. Fenn for my naive presumptuousness, but I'd be remiss not to give it my best shot anyway. If you don't care about hearing me talk about the music, then I'll summarize by saying that I enjoy Moonlighter quite a bit and sunk over 10 hours into it with my main playthrough, combined with New Game Plus adding new weapons and armor. It's a good game if you're the kind of person who wishes Zelda was more Dark Souls-like. And that's not just some meme, the guys who made the game specifically mentioned that they took a lot of nods from Dark Souls. There, I just saved you from leaving an angry comment.
Why does everyone compare everything to Dark Souls?
The soundtrack encourages an adventurous atmosphere paired with moments of calm contemplation. For example, the music that plays during the town segments consists of a hopeful, tender piano composition, with guitar and tambourine that switches depending on the vendor with whom the player is interacting. When you speak to the blacksmith, some heavier percussion elements are added, as well as a sharp striking sound that gives the impression of hitting a blade with a hammer upon an anvil. Approaching the alchemist plays what sounds like a dulcimer, mixed with some light bongo to represent the exotic, forbidden nature of her practices. And her portrait conveys a sense of mild irritation as you distract her from her deeply engrossing book, characterizing her with mild eccentricity. Interacting with the retailer shifts the lead instrument to a violin with some strings and a harpsichord to impress upon the player the highbrow constitution of his lavish services. The hawker, being a jack-of-all-trades who sells a variety of foreign oddities, has a concertina playing, which is essentially a miniature accordion that can be easily transported from place to place. I'm probably reading into that too much, but it seems like a natural fit considering his transient temperament. Speaking to the Banker plays a jovial mixture of clarinet and trombone, conveying the blunt avarice one might expect from a portly gentleman who only cares about his coin, reinforced by the fact that he can be seen preening his mustache, flipping a coin into his top hat, and checking his nails in his portrait art, a well-established body language symbol of disinterest. I think he's my favorite, just for these traits alone. The music all blends together really well since it essentially turns down specific elements but doesn't completely replace them. You can still hear the piano and tambourine in every musical piece, but it simply fades out in order to play beneath the new instruments. The track that plays in the Moonlighter shop might be my favorite track in the entire game, thanks to its eclectic musical arsenal. It has some gentle strings and kalimba for the main instruments, a bell tree to produce that sparkly effect, some tempo blocks for the quirky wooden sounds, as well as a single stroke on a bamboo guiro, or guiro if you want to be culturally accurate, some clicking castanets, and a cowbell, all of which combine to create a warm, earthy texture, which lends a musical illustration that helped me characterize Will as a forlorn merchant who secretly daydreams about his tedious workday coming to an end as he yearns to jump back into the exciting strife of the dungeons. It also picks up with some extra instruments like low sustained violin notes, as well as a vibroslap the moment you open your store for the day and welcome in the rush of customers. The dungeon music is also quite memorable. You have 4 dungeons, and I won't spoil the 5th and final one aside from playing some of the music. The Golem dungeon is about as basic as it gets, just a crusty old earthy temple with stone-based enemies. But as you advance through the stages, it gets more intense and the tempo gradually increases. Then the forest dungeon kicks off a tribal jig that reminds you you're in a parasitic jungle with poisonous vegetation around every corner. The castanets, flute, and marimba see plenty of use, as well as some sort of brass instrumentality. While the first 2 tracks see an increase in tempo similar to the first, the 3rd floor introduces a composition that sounds like the audio equivalent of a spiral into madness, with some pizzicato strings being plucked as the violin hits a dramatic crescendo, before being aided by a piccolo that carries a whimsical, hopeful melody. Then when you hit the final boss, the flute wavers along with some powerful war drums that, in my mind, invokes the image of a wild, caged monster being let loose and letting out an intense wail as it attempts to dispatch the foreign threat. The Desert Dungeon's music is nothing to write home about for me personally, as it just sounds like a far eastern mixture of clarinet and occasional sitar. But once you get to the boss, it mixes ancient and modern instruments to produce an intimidating final piece, utilizing the piccolo as well as some fierce guitar strums one might hear in a flamenco, with some electric guitar to intensely punctuate what I consider the toughest, most hectic fight in the game. And lastly, the Tech Dungeon soundtrack naturally consists of synthetic components, with a lot of synths and synthesized strings, as well as some occasional chiptune accents underlying the composition, producing mixtures of lonely, abandoned pieces, as well as even more metronomic timing to drive home the point that this is a sterile, abandoned environment laden with electronic abominations. The first three bosses all contain the title screen leitmotif, while the Tech Guardian has an implied variation of said melody that fits in organically to the frenzied electronic theme. been a while since I played a game with such an emotional, inspirational soundtrack, and that's including all the big AAA games we've had over the last few years. I hope that my analysis of Moonlighter's wonderful soundtrack will incentivize more people to pick up the game themselves, because it's the kind of score that you can only truly appreciate when it's blaring behind you during climactic boss encounters. And to David Fenn and the talented folks behind Digital Sun, thanks for the adventure.